Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Driving Force, LA's Impact on the Early Auto Industry. Our speaker today is Darryl Holter. He's CEO of the Shammas Group. He's an author, professor, and a board member of the World Affairs Council Town Hall. Our moderator today is Morgan Yates, who is a corporate activist, and he's an executive at the Automobile Club of Southern California. For those of you who would like to ask Darryl and Morgan questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, so just type your questions in at any time. Rachel Kenderdine will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which should start in about 35 or 40 minutes. And with that, Morgan, Darryl, welcome. And Morgan, let me turn this over to you.
Thanks, Kim. And Darryl, it's good to see you again. I've listened to a couple of presentations you've given, and they never get old. I'm always learning things. So let us start with, for those the viewers who haven't yet picked up your book, why don't you give us a rundown of how this project came about? In retrospect, knowing you're a historian and have worked in the car dealership business for many years, it seems like a natural thing, but there must have been an aha moment. And in your preface, you talk about it a little bit, but why don't you run through it for us?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Morgan, and great to be with you, Morgan, and great to be with you as a representative of the Automobile Club. I mean, the club goes back to the beginning of the origins of this industry, and it's been deeply connected, intertwined with the development of the automobile. So thanks for agreeing to be the monitor today. Appreciate it. Yes, well, I got involved in automobile dealership because of my father-in-law, who had automobile dealerships on Figueroa Corridor, which is the old historic auto row. And I was teaching at UCLA. My wife and I are both historians, and we came from the University of Wisconsin in 1991. But after the Rodney King riots and all the problems in LA and all the difficulties, my father-in-law found his health was in difficult shape, and he asked me to come and help him to reorganize his automobile dealerships, which were struggling downtown. So I went on leave from UCLA, and I came down and I started to work on this. So I've done this for a number of years, and got involved in reorganizing the Figueroa Corridor, building the business improvement district to make it clean and safe and good for reinvestment. And we started to rebuild the auto row, which when I started had about 5 automobile dealerships on 1995. I became a leader in the California New Car Dealers Association and the Greater LA Association of Dealers, and I was the chairman of it for a couple of years, and I did a lot of the lobbying with the legislature. And one day I received a notice. Someone said that in the Sacramento office of the Dealers Association, they found a bunch of old boxes with stuff in it that they were going to throw away. And somebody said, you better check with Darryl because he's a historian. So I went up to Sacramento and I opened up these boxes, and I found these oversized minutes of the meeting of the Motor Car Dealers Association of Los Angeles, 1905 to 1920. These are original documents by the dealers who organized the first meeting they had in 1905 up through 1920, all the minutes of their meetings. And also I had all the reports of the automobile show started by the dealers in 1907. These were incredible historical finding of what we call primary documents. I brought them back, we preserved them in the Natural History Museum, and I started to go through them all. And as I began then to research this, I decided that this is a topic that I really want to write a book about, because there were things in there that I thought I knew about as a dealer, but I was learning about the origins of this industry and how it started as a startup industry. I was so surprised by what I found, and I found it really interesting. And that was the origins of the book.
The focus geographically, of course, is on Los Angeles, and that makes sense given these primary documents that you've found. But as you dug into it, Darryl, What do you see about Los Angeles that kind of provides or informs your story, and provides that geographical framework for the story, which, was happening around the country? But what was it about Los Angeles that kind of, I don't want to use the word exceptionalism, but that kind of gives it a distinct spin or element of the story?
I think the most important thing is that Los Angeles and the automobile both grew up at the same time. They were infants when they started, they were teenagers here, and they grew into adulthood and maturation literally at the same time. Los Angeles wasn't developed like the eastern state, the cities on the eastern seaboard or in the Midwest, and it did kind of characteristics. It only had 100,000 people in 1900, but it had incredible weather, and this was a huge feature. This meant that you could drive automobiles year round. This meant that you could sell automobile year round. You couldn't do that in other areas of the country. This meant that usually it didn't rain very often, and the dirt roads, because streets and roads were dirt, they weren't that muddy that often. So there were also other geographical advantages that LA had to make it really a city of cars. And so the car developed, the city developed, they both grew together at the same time. And the population grew so much so that in 1910, it was about 300,000, 320,000. 1920, it was 600,000, that kind of growth. And the automobile grew at the same time. And so that the per capita, the number of vehicles per people, per population, was much higher in Los Angeles than in the rest of the country. So there were a number of elements why LA became a city of cars.
One of the things that I have always kind of taken an interest in or been interested in as I've learned about the kind of automotive history in the country, but in Southern California in particular, is how, as you say, in 1900, there were very few automobiles on the road, and but pretty quickly, those numbers increased and dramatically. And so the infrastructure that we don't even think about today because we're so used to it, it wasn't in place. And part of that infrastructure was really how automobiles were sold. We've seen a lot has been written about the kind of early innovators in automotive history, Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan and others. But your book really kind of touches on that infrastructure, that line from the automaker to the auto consumer that really hadn't been discussed before. And so maybe you could kind of give us a sense of how that infrastructure came to be.
Yes, I mean, after I finished studying the primary documents, I started looking at secondary material, and I went to look at other studies of automobile merchandising in New York and Chicago and Detroit, et cetera, and I found nothing. There was really no books, had really no serious historical studies of how this merchandising actually began. And what I found basically was this, that the automobile dealers, these entrepreneurs who were trying to figure out what they were doing on a trial and error basis, these people were the links between the manufacturers of automobiles on the one hand and the consumers on the other. And they were the vital links. They were the links that made it all happen. It couldn't have been done without them. The manufacturers themselves didn't have any money. They didn't have any capital. They were all competing. There were hundreds of them trying to make cars in garages, trying to figure out how to do this. And they were learning, they were trying to figure it out too. Banks wouldn't give them any money. They didn't have any money. So the automobile dealers became the important links. For example, if you wanted a car in those early days, you would go down to a dealer and say, I like this car that's sitting in your little showroom on Main Street. You've only got one car, it's a demonstrator, and I drove around the block and I like it. Okay, well, how do you get that car? Well, the way you get that car is by the dealer sends a deposit to the manufacturer. The manufacturer then uses that as working capital goes out and buys the parts because the manufacturers don't make parts yet. They go out and they buy the parts and they hire people to assemble that car together. And then they send it to you in a couple of months. That's the way it was done. So the dealers were the ones who provided the capital to the manufacturers to make the cars. And then the dealers were later the ones who, as we got into this, began to find ways to sell cars on credit. And then the dealers began to find ways how to deal with service at a time when there were no manuals and no one knew how to fix anything. So the dealers began to play this incredibly important role between the manufacturer and the customer. And that role then really defined what the dealers were. And they were figuring it out as they went.
One of the things that it's like one thing begets another, and you touched on it just a little bit. We've got automotive dealers who come on the scene and they have dealerships and showrooms and so forth. But once you start buying cars and using cars and perhaps using them up, or they need to be fixed, you got to figure out where to go. A blacksmith shop might work at part to start with, but there's probably parts that need to be procured in order to fix something that's broken, or you trade in a vehicle and to get something new. We're all familiar with that. And so what happens to these cars that have been used and maybe still viable, still have some life left in them? And your book kind of touches on the used car market that comes out of this. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and actually the book is structured to go through all of these different important items, the whole thing about why LA is a city of cars, the relationship between the dealers and the manufacturers and the customers. There's another chapter then on how the cars were sold on credit. There's another chapter on how automobile dealers dealt with service. There's another chapter on used cars. There's a chapter on women in automobiles, as we try to cover the whole scene. Essentially, the first cars that were made, again, they were just assembled. They weren't really made in a factory situation. Basically, the manufacturers would go out and get a carriage. They would go out and get four wheels. They would put some kind of a tilling device to steer it and some kind of a motor, steam, electric, or gasoline, and that was a car. They were really assemblers. They weren't manufacturing. That really only came with Henry Ford and the Model T. Developed in around 1908 or so, but manufacturing really didn't happen until then. And so the first cars that were out on the road, when they broke, they fell down. They were kind of crude the way they were put together. And I think a lot of times they just threw them away, discarded them, left them at the blacksmith shop. Didn't really know what to do because they didn't know really weren't many people who knew how to fix them. Now, bicycle repair guys, bicycle owners of bicycle shops who tended to be into bicycles, racing bicycles, got into cars. These are many of the primary dealers were bicycle merchants and bicycle enthusiasts. They knew about many of the mechanisms that go into the making of an automobile. And so they frequently on Main Street, which was the bicycle row became the auto row as the bicycle shops became transformed into automobile shops. We have several of the dealers who start out in the bicycle industry. So when a customer had a car that was damaged, they might go to the dealer and say, well, there's a problem with the car. I can't get it. The dealer might say, well, go down in the corner. There's a guy who hung a sign out, said that he can auto repair. Maybe he can help you. But after a while, the dealers know that doesn't really work because they want the customer to come back to them. They want to retain the customer. So they start to provide service for the customers so that those customers will bring their cars in and have them serviced and repaired at the dealership. Then the dealers understand that they will be inclined to come back to them when they're going to buy another car, when they're going to buy a new car. And this is what my father-in-law told me years ago when I started in this industry. He said, Darryl, you meet them in the front, you keep them in the back. And what he meant as a dealer was that you meet them when you sell them a car, but you retain them in the back with good service and good repairs that allows them to trust you. Then they will come back and buy their new car from you. And that's how the service departments developed and became big very large service departments, from not doing anything to basically having full service, then the parts counter, all the other attendant things. And the dealerships are getting bigger and bigger and bigger as they begin to move west in downtown LA towards Figueroa Street.
One of the interesting things I found in reading the manuscript for the book, Darryl, is the kind of the origin story of pricing used cars. You know, we talked a little bit about how you have new cars, but that's going to beget used cars, and you have a chapter and focus on a particular individual in your book that we know the name today, but maybe you could give us a little of the origin story.
This is very, very interesting about used cars, because at first, the new car dealers in their first meeting, they said, we don't have anything to do with secondhand cars. We will not discount our cars to take in a secondhand car. And they had that rule because the initial manufacturers said that you had to pay cash for every car that you bought. So you had to pay cash. The dealer had to make sure that the customer was paying cash, or the dealer was helping the customer pay cash in order to get that new car. And meanwhile, there began to be these, used car operations, but they were very different. To have a used car operation, you didn't need to have a facility. And you didn't need to provide service or do all these other things. You didn't have to provide dealer deposits. All you had to do was find a place where you had a parking lot and some cars that you could fix up, and you could sell them as used cars. And at this time, there were so many brands. For example, in 1910, in downtown LA, there were 105 brands. 105 brands of cars, including brands like Ajax and Detroiter, brands you've never heard of. There were so many cars, and the dealers had no idea what the value of those cars were. If you were a Chevrolet or a Ford dealer and someone brought in an Ajax and said, I'd like to buy a Chevy, but I got an Ajax, how much is it worth for a discount? The dealer had no idea what an Ajax was worth. That's what this interesting story comes in. Here's a kid who graduates from high school in Arkansas. He comes out to LA because he knows he's been on a farm. He knows how to work with tractors. He knows how to work with cars. He wants to be an accountant, and he wants to go to USC and study accounting. So he enrolls in USC, but he needs money. So he starts going around to auto repair shops where people have had an auto repaired and never had enough money to pick it up. And he would buy that car for $5 or $10, take it away from the auto repair guy, fix it up, paint it, and sell it as a used car. And every time he sold a car as a used car, he would write down the brand of that car, the year, and the amount of money that he sold it for. And he took those lists of all those strange brands and all that, and he would go downtown and he would talk to all the dealers, and he would say, hey, this is what I'll buy this car for you. If you take in a car on trade, I'll buy it for this price. And the same price is the same for all the dealers. It's fair for all of you. The dealers were so happy that they started buying more and more of their used cars from him. And his lot got bigger and bigger. And pretty soon he was on Figueroa with the other automobile dealerships in the 1920s. He's the largest used car operator, maybe the largest used car operation in the world. And that's Les Kelly from the Kelly Blue Book. The Kelly Blue Book started by Les Kelly as an accounting student at USC. And he's part of the story of the Figueroa corridor and the automobile industry here in LA.
One of the things that is really kind of eye-catching about the book are your end papers. And there's just row upon row of caricatures, all done by the same artist, because you look at these different people that are shown in caricature and profile, and they all look like they're related, which I found was kind of interesting. And I know the story, you told me the story about where these caricatures come from, and people can go and see them actually in their original setting. But for the purposes of your book, it really kind of illustrates how you had this great diversity of different car makes, as you talked about. And maybe you could tell us the story or the background about those caricatures in your end papers for the book.
One of the things we found was that the dealers were so interesting. A lot of them, came from different backgrounds. I mentioned Les Kelly. Some of them came from the Midwest and were relatively poor starting out. Many of them started as bicycle dealers. Some of them were, like one of them went to the University of Chicago as a student and really didn't get very good grades. He started to go to law school. He didn't get very good grades. He didn't really like it. Came to LA, started selling cars. He started selling Studebakers, ended up writing an essay for Mr. Studebaker on how to sell a car. He got to be a great salesperson. He met with Mr. Studebaker. Mr. Studebaker said, you won the contest for the best, essay on how to run a car. What would you like to be? And he said, I'd like to be a Studebaker dealer. He becomes a Studebaker dealer in LA, rises up in the organization, eventually becomes president of Studebaker. And his name is Paul Hoffman. He becomes president of Studebaker and eventually is actually named by President Truman after World War II to lead the Marshall Plan to redevelop Europe after the war. He's an incredible person and was a person who was mentioned as a good nominee for president in 1952. Although he said that he didn't think that a business person would be the best one to have for president. That was his view. But so there, all these very interesting people are highlighted in the book, and they're very, very interesting. And I gave them their special own sidebars for each of them so that they could stand out and you could see who these people really were. Very, very interesting. And I could go on and on about them, but I won't. If you get the book, though, you'll find that they're very interesting people.
Darryl, I mean, I know you said you want to kind of move beyond those, but give us just a little bit of a background on Felix Felix Chevrolet. Everybody knows the sign, and you own the dealership for a long time. You have a family connection to Felix Chevrolet, the oldest dealership in Los Angeles. Tell us a little bit about that.
Winslow Felix is a classic example of coming to LA and reinventing yourself. Wenceslao Felix is a Mexican family. He lived in Tucson. It was not yet a state. And his father is an accountant. He's fluent in English and Spanish. And Winslow Felix comes to Los Angeles because he wants to sell cars. He starts selling Buicks and some luxury cars. He gets hired by Chevrolet, and he becomes the used car manager for Chevrolet. He is in the World War I, fighting in the tank corps. He comes out and he's he reinvents himself as Winslow B. Felix. He's very handsome. He's a world-class polo player because he grew up riding horses in Tucson, and he hangs around with people in Hollywood. And he meets a guy named Pat Sullivan, who's the origin of Felix the Cat, the cartoon character. And because Pat has Felix the cat and Winslow is named Felix, they decide to cross market. And so the cat becomes the mascot for Felix Chevrolet, and Winslow Felix sells cars, especially to the Hollywood crowd. And to the friends of Pat Sullivan. So he markets the car. Cross-marketing is really what it calls. And with the growth of Felix the Cat, then the Chevrolet dealership really grows, and it becomes the one of the premier dealerships in the state. Winslow Felix, in a polo match in the mid-1930s, is in an accident where the horses collide, and he dies at the hospital. His wife takes over the dealership. In 1955, my father-in-law, Nick Shammas, bought the dealership from Ruth Felix and took it over and was the dealer until he passed away in 2003. And then I ran it until we sold it in December of 2022. But that's the story of Felix Chevrolet. We built the historic sign, and my father-in-law built it in 1959. And that's the historic sign of the sided sign of Felix Chevrolet.
I can see it from my office here at Adams and Figueroa. Whenever I look south out the windows from the third floor, you see the shrine, and then you see Felix Chevrolet. And it does remind me how Figueroa is really Auto Row. And there's another image from the collection of the Auto Club archives that was taken from the top of a Patriotic Hall that shows that corner at Washington and Fig, and it's the Felix used car lot that was taken in the 50s, I believe. And so it's one of those things that is a reminder for me, at least, is that you have this kind of geographic core of Auto Row, historically speaking, anchored by Felix Chevrolet down at Exposition and Fig.
Yes, and that's exactly what I tried to do when I went on leave from UCLA and came down, was to try to kind of reinvent the Auto Row. As I mentioned, there were about 5 dealerships there, and that was down from 52 new and used dealerships in 1927 on Figueroa and Flower Street. Of course, then there were many, many more brands. But when I started, there were about 5 dealerships left on Figueroa. And right now, if you drive down the street, you'll see about 12 of them. And there's 3 more that are coming in the next few years. And they're big. I mean, the new Nissan store that they built is 10 stories high.
Right.
So Figueroa is being reinitiated as the Auto Row, which is great for the Automobile Club because it's located on Figueroa where it should be.
One of the things I meant to ask you is knowing a little bit about the background of how your book project evolved. You originally started out figuring you were going to write it for yourself, but you brought in a co-author, Stephen G. And I know that the look of the book, among other things, has a lot to thank Stephen G. for. Maybe you could tell us a little bit how that evolved.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story, because when I wrote this manuscript, as I mentioned, this is the first book about how merchandising was actually done, based on primary documents that really kind of tell the inside story on how it was done. And because it was because I was doing it kind of for the first time, everything I found I included in the manuscript. And when I showed the manuscript to the Angel City Press, they said, well, this is almost 3 times too big. I had a tendency to want to include everything because I didn't want to leave anything out. I also wanted to have all these photos, and they said, well, then that will make it even harder to do. I also wanted to have these sidebars with all these individual people. There's about 15 of them in the book. And so this created a real space problem for me and for the publishers. But I had gotten to know Stephen because some of his previous books, and I have a chapter on dealer facilities, which talked about how Los Angeles dealers worked with great Los Angeles architects to build incredible dealerships, particularly the ones on Figueroa. Some of them are still in place right now, and you can see what they look like. If you go to the Palm restaurant, you'll see what a 1926 Cleveland Chandler dealership looked like. It's a beautiful building. I started to work with Stephen on some of these architectural things. And finally, we started working so closely together. I said, why don't you help me cut this thing down? I tried to cut it down and I can't cut it any further. And he and I worked on this thing in a really great working relationship. And then he also really helped me with a lot of the photos, because he had done a lot of photos in his other books dealing with architecture. So he really helped me a lot with respect to all the photos, the architectural pieces, and also some of the sidebars too. So it's really been a good relationship working with Stephen.
Anyone who's been to the Nethercutt collection in Sylmar, they recreated one of these grand automotive dealership interiors, or at least what they have an idea of what they look like based on all the photos. That is really quite striking. It's something to see, but as you say, some of the original ones, or at least the buildings, still survive in LA if you know where to look. One of the individuals that you that made the project that didn't end up on the cutting room floor is Sybil Geary, and there's a connection to the Auto Club with her, but it's your opportunity in the book to kind of give us a story of how women were involved and interacted and were consumers of automobiles as well. And I'm a little biased because she represents the organization I work for. But tell us a little bit about Sybil, if you would, because we don't know as much about her, and you've really kind of fleshed her out more than anybody has done before.
Sybil Geary is one of the most interesting people that I've ever known about in my life, I think, as a historian. And she was actually born and grew up not far from where I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She comes to LA in 1909. She's a stenographer. She gets hired by the Automobile Club. She works as a stenographer, and I don't have the exact chronology on this, but she works as a stenographer. And before long, they say, why don't you be the assistant editor of the Touring Topics, which is the monthly journal? And then pretty soon she becomes the editor. And then pretty soon they say, you know, we'd like to increase the membership in the organization, but it doesn't seem to be going as well as it should be. And so she checks on the membership, and she sees it really consists of a couple of guys who are behind a guest, and they give people tips on how, if they want to drive to San Diego, what the best way might be. And Sybil goes in and reorganizes this whole thing, and she hires these young girls who are graduates from high school. She teaches them all about maps. She brings maps out to show them how they can show people how to get to wherever they want to go. And she begins to take over the whole issue of what happens when people come in and they want to know how to get to someplace. And these young women are so effective at doing it that, and of course, the people that are coming in to get this information tend to be young, affluent men who are affluent enough to own a car. Mm-hmm. And they taken care of by these young women, and the young women say, you know, sir, you're getting this information and you're not a member of the club. We think that you should actually be a member of the club and pay dues and be a member. Begins to go up. And then Sybil moves into another position as the assistant secretary. This is secretary with a capital S, which is like an executive director. And she moves into that position and then becomes the actual secretary. And then she works on the road signage. What's the term you use for the road signage? All the road signage that the Automobile Club did on Southern California. She heads up that. Then she goes on and she heads up the omnibus legislation for the regulatory system for the automobile in the state of California. She puts together through the Automobile Club a legislative committee, and they work to pass this thing in the legislature. She does, however, have a nervous breakdown. She's working really hard. Mm-hmm. She breaks her ankle, and eventually she resigns from her position. But she played an extremely important role, and she was in the newspaper a lot. And so she's really kind of a star of the Automobile Club during this period. And I was so glad to find out about her and find out.
I know that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The role of women was extremely important, however, because with the electric car in particular, and this is something I never really knew about, women really liked electric cars because you could start it without having to crank it. And all you had to do was turn the ignition. And so meanwhile, electric cars were losing ground to gasoline cars because gasoline was dropping in price because of all the oil that was found in Texas and in Mexico. And so the electric cars decided that women liked them, so they started to tailor the features on the electric cars to women. So they started to add things that women really wanted, like a windshield so their hats didn't blow away, like windows on the side, like upholstery on the seating, like a glove compartment to put their gloves, like a vehicle that's lower to the ground so it's easy to get in if you have dresses on, like interior lighting, like all these kinds of things, like a cover on the top. So when it rains, you don't bother. All of these elements were started by electric cars to try to compete with gasoline cars by tailoring their cars to women. And in this way, the gasoline cars eventually incorporated all those same elements on their cars as well. So we can thank women and women's desire for what they wanted on cars for all those types of things that we take for common in cars today.
One of the bits of information I think that you uncovered or had a chance to see related to the book project that didn't happen until after it was essentially finished, if I have this right, Darryl, is a video, a film that you found or found out about with Earl Anthony, I believe, if I have that right. And I know you've talked about it a little bit before with other audiences related to the book, but tell us a little bit about that film. And
this is Ralph Hamlin, who starts as a bicycle guy, and he was a bicycle racer, and then he gets into automobiles. He gets a Franklin dealership, and he turns Franklin into a top-selling car. It's a air-cooled rather than water-cooled, and he becomes the top Franklin sales dealer in the entire country, and becomes very influential for Franklin automobiles, which were kind of a semi-luxury automobile, and were in existence until the Depression, when Franklin, as well as many other brands, went out of business because of the Depression. Hamlin, we found this in the Natural History Museum. We found this was an interview, a television interview of him done in 1970. And so he was one of the founders of the Motor Car Dealers Association in 1905 as I began my research. And he was around for all that period of time. And so it was a very interesting interview with him in 1970, someone who went all the way back to 1905. And it's about a 10-minute interview with him. And it's a very interesting interview, and it sheds light on a pioneer of this whole movement.
It's one of the great things about film or television is that you read about these historic characters and then they come to life on the screen. You can hear their voice, which is always quite a treat. And at this point, Darryl, why don't we send things back to Rachel, and she can queue up some questions from the audience if she's got that ready for us.
Thanks, Morgan.
Thank you, Darryl.
Yeah, thank you both so much for joining us today, and to our audience for the questions. So I want to start with a couple that we received about public transportation. The first is, in 1925, the Comprehensive Rapid Transit Plan for the City and County of Los Angeles, which would have turned the red and yellow cars into a unified rapid transit system, was released but did not move forward for political reasons. How influential were car dealers in preventing the red and yellow cars from being transformed into a more comprehensive system?
Yeah, I don't really know exactly. I do know that the automobile dealers were on a lot of things having to do with traffic, having to do with how streets were done, having to do with things like that. And I also know, because I had read quite a bit about, the idea that it was General Motors and the bus companies that stopped the transit system in LA. But when I started teaching at UCLA and I read Scott Bottle's book about it, his dissertation was on this topic, I learned a lot more about that. And so I don't really know what role the dealers played in those decisions. I did grow up in Minneapolis, where a similar thing happened with the transit system. And I do know that, unlike cities in the East Coast, the transit system that we had in LA was mainly based on moving people from the center of the city out to more outlying areas where they would sell tracts of residential land for people. And that many people did want to get free from that. And the automobile allowed them to go where and when they wanted. And so a lot of people liked the automobile as an alternative to it. The automobile also in those areas allowed them to go further back into the foothills, into the mountains, into the coast, et cetera. So I think there was a tendency for people to see the automobile as a lot more advantageous for their own personal freedom.
So the next question is, how did the economics of car sales work in the early days? Did auto dealers get a kickback from the manufacturer for each car they sold?
There was always manufacturers told that, especially in the earliest days, manufacturers told the dealers what they had to sell the cars for. And the dealers provided the capital to the managers to put those cars together until they got into mass production and it began to change. There would be a difference between the retail price and the wholesale price. And that difference is what the dealers would get when they sold the car. The cars at first could not be discounted. It was only later that there was any discounting. And that was really done by government involvement in making sure that the dealers weren't colluding on prices. And that really happens much later. But the dealers made the difference between the wholesale price and the retail price and that's how they made their profit on the new cars.
Our next question is, how did car dealers in this period affect the development of Los Angeles neighborhoods?
Well, really, the automobile dealerships were all located in downtown. I mean, as late as 1927 or into 30, they're almost all located downtown, in the downtown area. And it's only later that they begin to spread out into the suburbs as there is a movement away from the downtown center and the development of shopping centers outside in more of the suburban areas. And so many of the dealers go out there. It's also important, and not a lot, people may not know too much about this. Automobile dealers collect huge amounts of sales tax revenue, which then goes to the city and the state. I mean, we collect millions and millions and millions of dollars in sales tax revenue that goes to counties, or goes to cities in the states. And so, beginning in, and I don't exactly know when, because I didn't live here then, but I think beginning in the 1970s, and maybe even early, a lot of the municipalities outside of the city of LA would invite dealers to move into their areas, like move to their areas like Cerritos, Glendale, other areas, move into our areas, and then we will deduct from your property tax the amount of money that you collect in sales tax that goes to the city. So there was an economic incentive for a lot of dealers to leave the city of LA, to leave the center of LA, and move out to the suburbs. So in that sense, I think they did play a role in stimulating the growth in those suburban areas.
This question is in a similar vein, but this person asked, what are some of the most lasting impacts from this period on modern Los Angeles?
Well, I think, one of the things that I think the auto show was one of the things that started during this period of time and became really a massive thing involving, I mean, before too long, it was involving like 50,000 people coming to the auto show. That became very important and as a annual event in Los Angeles, and still continues to play that role today, even though in other cities it doesn't as much. So I think that's one of the things that came out of this period and lasted quite a bit. And I think also a lot of the other the way that the advertising of automobiles, its influence on the newspapers, which has now changed. Now it's all digital. It's had huge amounts of impact on the media in that sense too. So that's another area where automobile dealerships, sales of dealerships have an impact on the economy. Also, the number of people that are employed in the industry, it's pretty significant. I did an analysis of Felix Chevrolet in terms of how much it produced and gave back in taxes and in pay to employees, et cetera, over a 5-year period, and including the amount of money that we were collecting in taxes. It was like in the range of $70 million over a 5-year period of time. So there's a lot of money coming in that way too.
So you touched on this a little bit in one of your previous answers, but this audience member said, since you're a co-owner of Chevalier's books, it would be interesting to hear how cars facilitated the growth of retail and physical stores.
Well, they really did influence them. I mean, one example of that is probably in the one that's been written on the most is Wilshire Boulevard. I mean, Wilshire Boulevard, where it was downtown LA, which everything was located. But then as you go down Wilshire and the use of the car, I mean, allowing people to go back and forth on Wilshire, it's a perfect example of how the car stimulated that kind of growth. And the Wilshire going all the way down, really look at it all the way down to the ocean. Larchmont Boulevard is another kind of example of it if you use it. Larchmont Boulevard had the trolley that went from 3rd Street all the way up to Melrose. And that initially was and that's why when it was started by Charles Levante in 1919, he turned it into the carriage trade. So people would ride their carriage up to and they could buy whatever they wanted on Larchmont rather than going downtown. And then when the trolley was taken out, they put in angled parking and it became a parking. So it has that kind of a parking element, which is partly why Larchmont is successful, because it has that kind of angled parking there.
I can add a little bit, Rachel, this kind of the role or the impact that the automobile had in the economic setting. It's kind of similar to what Darryl's talking about. In 1906, the Auto Club started signposting roads, and the very first roads that they signposted, really nobody else was doing it, or certainly not in a way where the signs were readable from a moving automobile, was the routes from downtown out to the west cities. And it proved really popular because people in these automobiles who were traveling around were going to end up in some farmer's back 40. But the retail owners in the west side were really thrilled to see people showing up who weren't locals to spend money in their stores. And so you see from that point on, really the spread of economic activity that was tied to that advanced mobility that the car represented.
Great, thank you both for answering that one. The next question is, how did the auto and dealership practices established in Los Angeles spread to the rest of the country, if at all?
I don't really have other books that have talked about automobile dealers and merchandising in these other cities. We don't really know a great deal about it. When I went to look at the second, I thought I would find a lot of material, and I really didn't. You know, automobile dealerships are private. And many of the automobile dealers that I know that are third or fourth generation dealers didn't really know that their great-grandfathers did the kind of things that I talk about in the book, because they don't even really have, most of them don't even have that information, don't have those documentation. And so, you know, I don't really know to what extent what happened in LA spread. I do know that the impact of Hollywood and what was important, and also the customization of cars, the introduction of new additions to cars, new roofs, new wheel covers, various types of painting, all sorts of things in customizing cars starts in LA and does spread. And so as LA becomes a city of cars, it also becomes the one that is kind of in the vanguard of a lot of the new designs and cars. One of the people who went to USC and was on the track team, whose father had a shop downtown, his name was Harley Earl. He came downtown to work with his father and ended up designing cars and designed these beautiful cars. And he's the one who went to General Motors and designed the Corvette, and later designed the Corvair also. So there's a number of these people involved in customizing cars, which becomes part of a national trend.
So switching gears, we've had a couple of questions come in about electric vehicles. So the first one is, can you discuss the future of dealerships with Tesla introducing the direct sales model?
Tesla, the direct sale model is something that particularly the electric cars, the new cars are coming, would like to do. This is something that the original manufacturers wanted to do as well. In fact, Ford actually attempted to have its own dealerships and sell it and have its own employees sell cars, but they gave it up very quickly, for one thing, because they didn't want to have to pay for the facilities. They didn't want to spend the money on new facilities all around the country. It was way too expensive. They also found that the employees that they were hired weren't as effective as being really business people in terms of running their operations. And so they went back to a dealer model like all the other ones did. But Tesla, because it's new on the scene, has had a direct, and because it grew up in a period of the internet and of these kinds of sales. So it has pioneered this movement. it remains to be seen how effective it will really work when you get to a situation where you're doing the kind of volume that you're seeing in Volkswagen or in General Motors or in Ford, whether that kind of volume will allow you to have the kind of a relationship between the manufacturer and the customer that you have when you have the dealers in between. The manufacturers would like not to have anyone in between, but I think it remains to be seen if that will really work when you get to large volume. My next door neighbor has a Tesla, and I know that there are issues that come up around service and other things that he's talked about, and I guess it remains to be seen.
On a similar note, what changes do you think will take place over the next several years as we see a shift to electric vehicles in California? Do you think LA will once again lead the way in terms of EV infrastructure?
Well, California already is. I mean, half of the EVs in the country are sold here. We've always led the way in electric cars. And so I think that we will continue to do that. I think that we're making the transition. It's an important transition. And I built the brand new Felix Chevrolet building behind the historic showroom, the new parts and service and parking facility, which is really huge, 4 levels high, and has stackers going up to the sky, about 150 cars on the roof, going up 4 cars high. But that incorporated all the conduit and all the work that we will need to have to shift to an electric vehicles across the board. That's what General Motors is planning on doing. I was on the dealer advisory committee on electric cars appointed by Mary Barra, and went to Detroit, and we talked a lot about this, about how the transition will take place. Service will be different because there'll be more of a rather than doing some of the repair work that we do now, there will be pulling out a component and putting in a new component, so that there will be some changes in service. There'll be a lot of changes, but I think that we will lead the way, and I think it'll be much better for the environment. So I think it's a good change.
You know, and one of the things that I see a historical parallel with is in this period of time that Darryl's book covers, those first 3 decades of the 20th century, the infrastructure wasn't really able to keep up with automobile use, and it was always playing catch up. Everything from the design and engineering of roads to just all the infrastructure that we need for automobiles back then, gas stations and so forth. They're always playing catch up, and I think we're seeing that again with the unique infrastructure related to electric cars in our current era. So I find that parallel always kind of interesting when it occurs.
So switching gears a little bit, this audience member asked, what was the relationship of the growth of cars in LA to the movie industry?
The automobile had a really positive impact on the film industry in Los Angeles. And partly it was because in the past, before the car, the actors would have to put on their outfits, their makeup, and whatever their costumes were, and then they would get on the trolley and ride the trolley to where they were going, and then they would have to be, somehow they would walk or whatever, get to where they were going to do the shooting, where the filming was going on. And also all the attendants that were bringing the props, the cameras, the lighting, all that stuff, had to carry all that stuff onto the trolleys and bring it down to the studio, the fixed studio where they would do this work. And then after it was over, they would have to haul it all back. That took a lot of time. And when the automobile came, it really sped things up for them. And it's really interesting and we talk about it a little in the book, but what some of the filmmakers said about this, and they talked about how a film that used to take months of us to do, we can do weeks, or what it used to take weeks, we can do in days. they also were able to go to all kinds of locations for filming. They didn't have to just go to a fixed studio someplace. They could go, there were all kinds of places to do filming. So you had this great liberation for the filming industry, which you didn't have in other cities as much. And it was very, very important for the industry here. And it's interesting how they talked about it. The other thing was movie stars that liked a certain car and would, in a sense, advertise a particular car. They liked a car and they would drive that car and people would see it. So that was another element between cars and Hollywood.
So for our final question, we were talking a little bit about this before we started the live stream, but one of our audience members would like to know, what was the make of your first car?
Well, can I tell the story? Okay. My first car, well, I was with my dad. We were looking at used cars. It's 1962. I was in 9th grade. We looked at a little, this is in Minneapolis. We looked at a little shop in the evening, and it was closed, but you could look at the cars. The newer cars in 1962, the newer cars were parked in front. I went to the back lot and I found a 1949 Mercury. And so I said to my dad, I said, there's a really nice 49 Mercury in the back. And my dad said, well, Darryl, that's really pretty old. I don't think we want one that old. I said, yeah, but Dad, this one's really clean. Let's go look at it. So we looked at it. He said, yeah, it's real clean, but it's really old. And I said, yeah, okay. So then I went back to school the next day. I went to hockey practice afterwards because it was Minnesota. That's what you did. You played hockey. And afterwards, I went to my girlfriend's house, Jane Peck. And then I called my mom to come and pick me up in her Chevrolet. And I'm talking to Jane and I'm talking about this 49 Mercury I saw last night. And I say, and it's like that one that's driving down the street right now. And I looked at it and my dad was in it. My dad had gone and bought the car and I paid him $299. It was my car. And when I was 15, I was able to drive it. 49 Mercury. I told my dad, this is one that James Dean had in Rebel Without a Cause. My dad said, I don't know what you're talking about. That was my first car.
A great story. But thank you both so much for being here and for being a part of this conversation. Your expertise was just wonderful. So I'll turn it back over to the two of you and Kim for any closing remarks.
Thanks, Rachel. I can't let you go, Darryl, without, we talked about the movie industry and the impact the cars had, but it's also had a little bit of an impact on the music industry. And some people know you as a musician, a singer and a songwriter and a guitar player, but you have a song that you wrote about cars. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I have a song called Don't Touch My Chevy, which I put on my first album that came out in, I don't know, 2008 or something. It was about my 1950 Chevy, which was a car that I found at Felix Chevrolet. I was at Felix Chevrolet and I said, what is that that's covered up over there? That's an old car. And they said, oh, that's a 1950 car. I said, where did it come from? Well, someone left it here. They never picked it up. I said, well, when did they leave it here? They said, well, I think it was in 1959 or 1962. I said, well, now it's 1995. So then I took off the cut. That was my black 1950 Chevy. So I wrote a song called Don't Touch My Chevy.
Well, Darryl, I want to thank you for sharing with viewers the story that you've uncovered with this great book. And Kim, let me turn it back over to you.
Well, all of you I know are just as excited as I am to get this book. And the title is Driving Force, Automobiles and the New American City, 1900 to 1930. And I think we've got information about it on the chat. I could just keep listening to these stories for another hour, but I know we can't. But thank you both so much. This was phenomenal. So Darryl, thank you for all of that wonderful history, and same with you, Morgan, and all of those anecdotes that are so timely today with the new electric vehicles coming on board. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Kim, and thanks to the LA World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I like the organization and I like to support it, and I'm glad you were able to bring Morgan and I into the camp today. Thanks.
It's our pleasure.